I wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. The invitation had arrived like an afterthought, a curt text from Madison at 11:03 p.m. the night before. Hey, if you want to come to my Vogue dinner tomorrow, you can. Just dress nice, please. No emoji, no warmth, just that familiar clipped tone that said you're not really part of this world, but I'll let you orbit mine for a night. Madison had always been that way, curated, commanding, cold. The kind of woman who moved through rooms like an event herself. She had the looks, the charm, the sheer gravitational pull, and she knew it. She learned early on that being seen mattered more than being sincere, and she played that game better than anyone I knew. So when I stepped into that towering glass-paneled loft in Tribeca, it felt less like I was entering a celebration and more like I was stepping onto a runway I hadn't been invited to walk. The place glowed in 1,000 hues of wealth. Understated, of course, the kind of luxury that whispers. Sculptural furniture in muted stone, minimalist floral installations, staff in crisp black carrying trays of handcrafted appetizers that looked too pretty to eat. I watched a waiter explain to a guest how the sashimi had been flown in from Tokyo just that morning. And above it all, Madison, the star. She stood by the center table, backlit by the city's skyline like a billboard come to life, champagne in hand, laughing with a group of people I only vaguely recognized from magazines and brand campaigns. She wore something shimmery, metallic, and perfectly fitted, her blonde hair swept into a polished bun that looked effortless but probably took an hour. I stayed near the wall at first, trying to breathe, to ground myself. My dress suddenly felt louder than I intended, soft navy silk with a subtle sheen, cut just low enough in the back to suggest elegance, with folded shoulders that framed my collarbones delicately. I'd spent 3 weeks on it, sewing between client fittings and late-night ramen cups. Every stitch was mine. Every pleat whispered who I was trying to become. But in that space, surrounded by gowns that cost more than my rent, it felt like a whisper no one could hear. Madison spotted me eventually. Her glance skimmed over me like a scan, her expression unreadable. Except for the tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth. She turned back to her group without a word. Not a nod. Not even a forced smile. And just like that, I was reminded, you don't belong. Still, I didn't leave. I walked to the table, took a seat beside a guy who just pitched a tech startup to an investor across from him. No one asked who I was. No one noticed the handmade dress, but that was okay. I wasn't there to be noticed. At least not yet. I thought maybe if I just stayed quiet, observed, made it through the evening without drawing fire, I'd survive the night with some dignity intact. I was wrong. Because I'd forgotten one thing. Madison never let me stay invisible for long. And if there was one thing she loved more than being adored, it was reminding me of my place. The dining table stretched like a runway under the golden lights, all marble and mirror polish, framed with crystal glassware and orchids sculpted into centerpieces. Every guest had the same hyper-curated air. Lean, lacquered, dressed in draped silks or tailored minimalism. Conversation flowed like Prosecco. Effortless, polished, performative. I had been seated, strategically, I now realize, at the outer rim of relevance. To my left, a chiseled bored actor who hadn't looked up from his phone. To my right, a beauty influencer with 4 million followers who smiled at me only when asking for more water, mistaking me twice for catering staff. I smiled back and poured, not bothering to correct her. It wasn't worth it. The room pulsed with vanity. Between Instagram photo ops and bursts of laughter too loud to be real, I sat quietly, tasting every grain of my own awkwardness. And then came her voice. Madison's laugh, sharp, bright, deliberate, sliced through the din like a fire alarm. People turned. Forks paused midair. She stood, poised at the head of the table like a hostess on a reality show reunion episode, her voice loud enough to ensure no one missed the punchline. "Oh my God, Emily," she said, eyes scanning me like I was the entertainment. "That little dress, did you pick it up from a flea market, or did the Salvation Army have a clearance sale?" She tilted her head, lips curled in mock curiosity, and then she sipped her champagne. The silence that followed was electric, tight and buzzing, like the moment just before a bulb explodes. Then someone, I didn't see who, chuckled. A man across the table gave a low whistle. The influencer beside me covered her mouth and giggled. And then they all laughed. Not in the polite, awkward way people sometimes laugh to smooth over discomfort, but in that cruel, indulgent way that says, We've decided you're beneath us, and it's fun. My throat tightened, my spine burned, my hands went cold. I looked down at my lap. The soft folds of navy silk stared back, quiet and beautiful, now soaked in shame. The very thing I'd poured myself into, the dress I had shaped with calloused fingers and careful dreams, now felt like a costume for a clown. I didn't move. Couldn't. I focused on my plate, on the pattern of the china, on not letting the tears win. If I blinked too fast, they'd fall. If I breathed too hard, they'd hear the crack in my chest. Madison didn't offer a second glance. Her smirk lingered satisfied, as she returned to whatever story she'd been telling about backstage at Paris Fashion Week. Like humiliating me had been a brief detour, an amuse-bouche before the main course of her self-congratulation. But inside me, something shifted. Not a fracture, a furnace. Shame turned molten. Embarrassment gave way to something heavier, hotter, more dangerous. I'd swallowed Madison's jabs my whole life. I'd played the quiet sister, the overlooked one, the afterthought. But this wasn't teasing. This was something else. A public dressing down designed to remind me, and everyone else, that I didn't belong. And yet, I didn't leave. I didn't run. Something in my gut, quiet but fierce, told me to stay. Something was coming. And for once, I wasn't going to miss it. About 30 minutes had passed since the mockery. The sting still pulsed beneath my skin like static under silk. I hadn't spoken. No one had. At least not to me. The laughter had dissolved into fragmented conversations and the clinking of glass. But something was different. The air had shifted, as if the loft itself were inhaling. Posture corrected. Eyes flicked toward the door. There was a murmur, low and reverent. He's here. A ripple rolled across the room like a wave before a storm. Forks lowered. Even the influencer beside me paused mid-selfie. The entire room turned toward the entrance as the double doors swung open on silent hinges. He stepped through like a shadow that had chosen to take form. Julien Devereaux. Even if you didn't follow fashion, you knew him. There was an aura to the man, not manufactured, not performed, but elemental. As if the fabric of every room he entered shifted to accommodate his presence. He wore a long charcoal coat that moved like smoke, the collar slightly raised. The silver rings on his fingers caught the light with each movement of his hand. His hair was dark, soft-looking, tousled in a way that suggested he'd walked through a windstorm and made it art. He wasn't young. He wasn't trying to be. He didn't need to. He had presence, the kind people chase their whole lives. As he entered, the room recalibrated. The influencers straightened their necks like swans. The execs dropped their voices half an octave. Madison nearly dropped her champagne. She wasn't used to being surprised. I watched her compose herself like a reflex. Shoulders back, jaw relaxed, her lips smoothing into that signature faux sultry smile she wore for press photos. She moved forward as if on instinct, weaving her way toward him with predatory precision. She was already halfway through her breathy laugh, the one she used when name-dropping celebrities she'd never met, when Julien lifted his gaze. And bypassed her. Entirely. He didn't pause, didn't falter. He moved through the crowd like he'd been summoned by a silent thread pulling him across the room. And then his eyes found me. A flicker, not of confusion, not of calculation, but of recognition. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze narrowing with curiosity. Purpose. My heart was hammering so loudly I could feel it in my fingertips. I wasn't sure what I expected when I saw Julien Devereaux walk into that room. Certainly not this. Not the cool heat of his stare resting on me while the whole room watched him, waiting for him to gravitate toward her. But he didn't. He looked at me as if he were searching for something, and had just found it. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes begin to turn, slowly, curiously, recalibrating their gaze. Madison froze mid-step. Her laugh died on her lips. Her face, for the first time all night, had no performance left to offer. Something was happening. And I was no longer the afterthought in the room. I was the axis it had begun to turn on. He crossed the space between us as if everything else in the room ceased to matter. Like the air bent around him. Like he followed a thread no one else could see, and it led straight to me. Julien Devereaux stopped just beside the table, his eyes fixed not on my face, but on the folds of navy silk resting over my shoulders. He didn't blink. He didn't speak at first. Just absorbed, the way artists do when they see something familiar, something intimate, something once theirs now reborn. Then, with quiet command, his voice clear and deliberate, he said, "I recognize this piece. Who are you?" The words seemed to ripple outward. Every conversation died. Glasses paused mid-sip. Madison's entire dinner party leaned into the silence like it might break. I stood, unsteady but upright. I made it. I designed it. Julian's eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time that night, I felt truly seen. Not in that hollow social media way, but seen, like he had pulled me out of the static. His gaze returned to the dress. He reached forward, not to touch, but to trace the air above the fabric. This draping, the way the shoulder folds pull toward the spine, it's reminiscent of something I sketched years ago. A silhouette I never published. You must have seen that piece. I nodded slowly. It was buried in a profile, Surface Magazine, 2017. One of your early interviews. The concept sketches were half-shadowed in the background. He smiled, wide now, a smile that carried no performance, only quiet awe. You remembered, and you gave it breath. He exhaled, shaking his head in admiration. You brought it to life, with your own voice. Beautiful. Then his tone shifted, warmer, deeper, reverent. I made that design for a muse, but I never found the right one. He looked straight into my eyes, until now. The silence in the room thickened. It wasn't shock anymore. It was reverence, confusion, recalibration, as if the narrative had shifted and no one knew their role anymore. And then, from just behind me, I heard her voice. Madison. Brittle, clipped, laced with a desperation she didn't yet recognize in herself. She's just my sister, she said, almost choking on the word. She works in some little sewing place in Brooklyn. Julian's expression didn't change, not at first, but the stillness that followed was cutting, deliberate. He turned toward her slowly, gaze firm. No, Madison, he said, voice now edged with quiet steel. She doesn't work in a place, she creates. He let that hang in the air. And perhaps, he added, instead of mocking talent, we should be celebrating it. The temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. The murmurs that followed were not laughs. They were the subtle churn of opinion shifting, of egos rearranging. Madison's expression shattered, just for a second, before she gathered the pieces, each one sharp and trembling. But me? I stood taller. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because in that moment I realized I didn't have to anymore. Everything changed, but not in the way people expect when they hear stories like this. Yes, Julian offered me an internship that night, right there in front of everyone, with no theatrics, no second guessing, just a quiet confidence that echoed through the room like a verdict. Come work with me, he'd said. There's something in you that the world should see. I remember blinking at him, almost sure I'd misheard, but I hadn't. 2 months later, that internship became a paid design role. One of my dresses, a reinterpretation of the same silhouette I wore that night, was featured in a capsule collection for House Devereaux's Rising Talent Initiative. Suddenly, editors who wouldn't have glanced my way before were asking me about influences, technique, form. They quoted my name in articles, invited me to events. Not as Madison's sister, just Emily. It was surreal, but not overwhelming, because what shifted inside me that night was more permanent than the offers or applause. It was the quiet dismantling of a story I didn't realize I'd been living inside, the story where I was the shadow, the less than, the cautionary tale of what it meant to be almost. For so long, Madison had been the measuring stick. Every room I walked into, I'd scan for her reflection. In the comments, the comparisons, the way people tilted their heads when they realized who I was. I let her frame the narrative. I absorbed her condescension like it was truth, not poison. And she was always so good at it. Her jabs came with polish, her criticism laced in folks' concern. You'd be so pretty if you just dressed differently. Are you still working in that tiny studio? You should post more on social, people forget about you. But after that night, her words no longer rooted themselves in me. They hovered, empty, stripped of their power. She didn't speak to me for weeks. When she did, it came in the form of dry, brittle texts. Congrats on the internship. Hope you're not getting coffee for everyone. Saw your dress on Insta. Cute. Bit derivative but nice. Devereaux's is known for giving out pity opportunities. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. She was still trying to pull me into the role I used to play, the small one, the one who explains herself, who tries to prove her value with polite restraint. But I'd already stepped off that stage. The real justice wasn't just the opportunity, the recognition, or even the applause. It was the realization that I didn't need her approval, that I never had. The justice was in reclaiming my own narrative, in seeing my reflection unfiltered by her distortions. And that dress? The one she laughed at. It hangs now in the Devereaux studio archive, the original piece that sparked the collection. Julian calls it the Muse prototype. Clients ask to try it on. Editors ask for its story. But to me, it will always be more than fabric and thread. It was the first time I stitched together my voice and wore it out loud,